He had this warm humanity. He was without pretensions. He was a man of very considerable personal courage. He was dying of cancer in his last years. He still received his friends as usual. He knew, or believed he knew, that he was certainly not immortal, but this didn't disturb him in the least. It very much disturbed Boswell when Boswell interviewed him towards the end. But he managed to retain that sort of equanimity and moderation and cheerfulness, which was his own ideal.
Yes. And his style has had great influence, hasn't it? I mean, I mentioned earlier in this discussion 2 20th century British philosophers, both of them famous, A.J. Ayer and Bertrand Russell, who have been consciously influenced by the Hume way of doing things, and there have been many others.
Yes, well, he did place this great emphasis on clarity and indeed on elegance. I recently heard clarity and elegance referred to as old-fashioned virtues, which nobody now attempts. But certainly Ayer and Russell attempted them, and certainly Hume attempted them. And he set a certain pattern of British philosophizing in which one tries to be clear, one tries to be critical, one tries not to make large assumptions, one tries to look all the while at what one's doing in a critical spirit, and one tries to tie it up to what actually happens in the world.
Hume's approach does raise one important difficulty, doesn't it? You refer to the fact that he stresses that most of the things that we take for granted we don't actually know and can't prove, can never prove. That being so, how are we to distinguish between the sort of view that it's reasonable to hold and the sort of view that it's unreasonable to hold? What then becomes the criterion of a reasonable man's belief?
This is a very difficult question. At times, Hume seems to be saying nothing more than that, well, in general, it's much more sensible to rely on constant conjunctions than on mere chance. He gives rules for judging of cause and effect. At other times, he seems to suggest there's really no answer to this question. But that is something that I think would satisfy nobody. And one might say that is the principal problem that Hume set. I referred to it in a way a little while ago. We agree, let us say, that scientific laws are not demonstrable in the strict sense. Why, however, is it still far better to depend on these in our practical affairs of life than in some silly idea that someone thinks up in a bestseller?
See, I think that what Hume had to say about all this is very germane to the ideas about science that most people have today in the 20th century. My impression is that most people, including most well-educated people, have the idea of science that it consists of a body of known, demonstrated, proved certainties, and that the growth of science consists in adding new certainties to the body of already existing ones. Anybody who has that view of human knowledge or that view of science really has a very fundamental lesson to learn from Hume, don't they? I mean, Hume retains his full power to disconcert today, doesn't he?
Yes, Hume is an extremely disconcerting thinker. I think it's still true in respect to science, that science does make certain. There's all sorts of things we know about the world we didn't know before scientists got going. But certainly when a lot of people, for example, think of science as something where there's no room for the imagination at all, they believe that you have all sorts of need for the imagination if you're writing a novel or writing a play, but when you're doing a science, it's just a question of going into a laboratory and seeing what happens. Now, this is nonsense. Any kind of scientific work above the most trivial is an enormous feat of the imagination. If you take contemporary cosmology, for example, it's, well, this is admittedly a very extreme example, but it's an extraordinary imaginative feat. And the same is true of things like DNA, genetics. Any of the great discoveries require not merely careful work in laboratories, though this is essential, and careful thinking at all levels, but also a capacity to make imaginative leaps. And it's interesting that in Hume, the idea of the imagination constantly reemerges as being of central importance. The imagination, he thinks, is essential to all our thinking about the world. Even in what we call our perception of facts, there is always an element of the imagination at work. And the centrality of the imagination is one of the things I find most fascinating in David Hume.
it's directly germane to what you've just said that the greatest of all 20th century scientists, Einstein, once said, he said in 1928, I remember, he made the remark, that he would never have dared to overthrow the science of Newton had he not read Hume. Well, I'd like to finish our discussion, really, by asking you to say a little more about the influence of Hume on major thinkers subsequent to him. He did, you've already referred to his influence on Kant, who I think most philosophers would regard as the greatest of all philosophers since Hume. What was his influence on Kant?
Well, I think that Kant, unlike the British critics of Hume, really did see what Hume was about. He saw he had to do philosophy in a quite different kind of way. And if he was going, as he wanted to do, to answer Hume, and particularly to get rid of what he took to be the sceptical elements in Hume, he had to say that really our perception of the world is of a quite different kind from the sort of thing that Hume and his predecessors had taken it to be. We don't, as Hume always presumes, have isolated perceptions simply following one another. We are from the beginning aware of things as being causally connected, causally linked with one another. One gets in Kant, however, a great emphasis on the creative power of the mind as well. The suggestion of this order is in part imposed by the mind, and that leads in a direction that Hume wouldn't have liked. It leads in the direction of subsequent German idealism, in the direction of writers like Hegel.
But Kant did see, didn't he, that if you started with empiricist assumptions, Hume then posed problems that on empiricist assumptions you couldn't answer.
That was his view.
And Kant's solution was to reject the assumptions and start a wholly new approach.
He does see, I think, the essential thing, that if you begin from the position that what we're aware of are isolated events, whether they're in our own mind, whether they're perceptions or on the surface of our skin or in the world, you cannot create out of them, simply as your soul material, the kind of ordered world which, in fact, we experience in our daily lives.
Well, to continue the discussion beyond this point would take us into a discussion of Kant, so I think we'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Passmore.
Good, thank you.